Tasha Epley, and I read the novel Educated by Tara Westover. It was published in 2018. I selected this title page image because it represents the world that the narrator Tara constructed regarding her education. The middle represents the narrow lens that she grew up in the Idaho mountains, and then the outside city represents her self-reliant, self-made education when she traveled to Utah and Cambridge and Boston for her formal education, where she ultimately earned her PhD. I chose this novel because I had some personal connections to the story. I grew up in a really rural area in West Virginia, and it was very isolated. Even though I value my religious upbringing, it was very strict and a lot of rules. And I've gone through a similar process as Tara describes in the book, of looking at what I was taught and putting against the Bible to develop what I believe. Also, from moving from my family for educational purposes. So when I graduated high school, I also moved away and moved around the country, and that really built a lot of my educational experience and philosophies. I also aspire to write a memoir one day just about my adventures in life, so that was interesting to me. And then I found out that I actually lived in Utah during the same time that she was telling her story, so that was interesting. And then her description of the impacts of education and travel really resonated with me. So a summary of the story: she grew up in a very rural, isolated area in Idaho, in the mountains of Idaho. Bucks Peak was a very important place to her. And she experienced isolationism, religious fundamentalism within the Mormon faith, and then survivalistic tendencies of her family. She grew up on a very limited homeschool curriculum based on her memoir and her experiences. Her father was preparing for the end of the world, and just very fear-based mentality, and always had the family prepping for that. She worked at a dangerous junkyard that was family owned, and then she was self-taught to pass the ACT so that she could go on for her higher education at Brigham Young University, which led to fellowships and grants and scholarships to Cambridge and Harvard. And then this mainly was the story of her growth in self-awareness, self-reliance in the style of a memoir. Some educational themes that were present were education as a lifeline. She describes how she was just surrounded by the philosophies of her family since they were so isolated, and that education really became a lifeline. She describes math as logic and structural, and it's the first really logical, structural, reliable thing that she had experienced. So once she started teaching herself, it really inspired her to learn more. It also showed the family role and influence in generational education. Tara explains that most of what she learned was what she was taught, and she didn't know to even question it until she met other people who didn't believe the same way she did. It shows the value of accessibility to higher education, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next few slides. It shows the valuable resource of technology and how that also served as a lifeline and a way out of her experience. It shows mental illness and abuse. She describes both of those in her novel and the effect that it had on her as a young student. And then the value of travel and experience in educating one socially and opening one's mind academically. And then self-discovery and self-development as she did leave her family and make a new life for herself. So I chose to look at the contemporary educational time period, which is usually considered from 1950s till modern time. So this novel was set in 1986 to 2018. She was born in 1986, and the novel was published in 2018. So it describes the span of her life then. So in the book, some contemporary educational issues that were represented. The rise of technology is really important during this time period with the development of the computer and the internet, and then the integration of technology into classrooms and homes. So throughout the novel, the technological things that Tara had access to really became a way to connect her with the larger world and to educate her of these things. So a radio, music, television, email, even the technological elements of the theater, they all inspired her to not just accept the life that she had on Bucks Peak, but to seek something more for herself. Contemporary education also increased educational accountability with many acts such as No Child Left Behind and standardized testing and mandatory schooling, and just a lot of regulations passed on what was expected out of an adequate education. So all of those are seen in the novel. It is compared often, a public education versus the homeschooling experience. When Tara wanted to go to college, she had to study to pass the ACT. And then once she gets into higher ed, she hits a lot of struggles and roadblocks because she realizes what she had missed in her homeschooling, and she had to learn quickly and teach herself in these higher education institutions. Then lastly, in the novel, the accessibility of higher education. So the author Tara does a great job about describing her lack of money and how grants and scholarships really played a vital role. The older siblings, two of the brothers, had also pursued higher education, and that really inspired her. And then she describes the influence of professors and peers and counselors at the higher education. And so you can see the impacts that had on her life. So the educational connection continues. The familial influences on education is seen in this novel. The generational transference of knowledge. The grandparents disagreed with the parents' ways of raising their children, and so that served as a dichotomy for Tara to see the way that her father and mother were explaining education, and then contrasting that to the grandparents. The father was very skeptical about outside education and anything that wasn't related to the church or nature. And then the mother was very submissive to the father throughout the novel, which caused some conflict in multiple areas. And then the siblings, the author did a really good job of describing which siblings sought public education and higher education versus those who continued on their generational paths. And she just compared and contrasted those two. Tara, the author, also describes certain values and how that has an influence on education. Religious upbringing and beliefs shaped a lot of what she believed about education, especially as a woman. And then the cultural influences of growing up in her town in Idaho, and then just questioning her perception of the truth at the end by her parents really impacted her views on education. All right, how can this time period of contemporary education both positively and negatively impact American education? So I've discussed its impact on the novel and the author, but as a whole, there were some specific characteristics to the contemporary educational movement. First, standardized education, which required testing and monitoring and mandatory schooling. And so this movement really affected American education. It made it more structured. It brought a lot of standards and requirements on teachers and educational institutions, administration. And it also changed the requirements for schooling. So even those parents who decided to pursue homeschooling, there was more accountability placed in their required homes, the way that they were going to do schooling. The rise of technology, it improved connectedness and lessened isolation. This is also seen in the novel, but students are able to connect and see beyond their own world. They're able to fill in any gaps they have in knowledge and be self-taught. And then it also teaches 21st century skills of critical thinking and communication that aren't necessarily specifically taught in schools, but more as skills. Mentoring has also become popular and important during the contemporary educational movement. Peer mentoring, professor and teacher mentoring, and then professional counseling has really risen as a way to support the mental and social and emotional health of individuals. This was highly noted in the novel and continues in our current culture of American education to be important. Number 4, higher education accessibility. This has become a very important topic, especially regarding financial limitations and the cost of higher education, both to get in and to maintain the higher education. Also financial support, such as financial aid, and then college and career readiness, which provides the insight that students will need to advance in the colleges and do well. Noted some other contemporary education philosophies and aspects that weren't really related to the novel, but in chapter 11 he highlighted 4 important aspects of the contemporary education movement from 1950 till modern times, and those included teacher organizations such as NEA and the AFT, raising academic standards, especially in the 80s under President Reagan, with a focus of improved academic achievement, educational leadership and leaders, global competition, and increased behavior and performance, as well as looking at the correlation between those two. Thirdly, the controversy of teaching evolution of Charles Darwin's concepts in school. And then finally, globalization in education and just building systems and networks globally across cultures and countries. This is a list of my 5 references that relate to the previous slide regarding the contemporary education movement. And lastly, I enjoyed this book. It was very eye-opening to me as an educator, just to see the lived experience of the student who grew up in isolationism and from this religious perspective, and how she went on a journey of self-discovery and self-development and wrote this memoir. And I really enjoyed it, and I saw a lot of ties to the contemporary education movement in both positive and challenging ways. So if anyone is interested in a perspective of a memoir where a girl starts with very limited knowledge about the outside world and then starts a journey to connect to it, I would definitely recommend this book.